Hello, this is Joe from High Comp Performance Engines. Today we're going to do a little tutorial video for you about Holley carburetors, including their power valve. So this video is specifically about power valves and how we can use the power valve to tune a Holley carburetor to make it almost as good as a fuel injected car, right? So we're going to work on that transition from light throttle to full throttle. Okay, and we need the power valve to help us do that. And that's why I have a fuel injected car on my dyno. So if we're going to see how we're going to tune a carburetor to try to emulate EFI, we need to see what EFI looks like. So this is a fuel injected LS with an aftermarket ECU. It's running in perfect condition. We've got a computer on it which is controlling the fuel. So we've got short-term fuel trims, we've got long-term fuel trims. Everything's running perfectly. So we're going to show you what this one looks like on the dyno in terms of the air-fuel ratio, and then we're going to try to emulate that with a carburetor. We're going to get a carbureted car in here, and we're going to use the Holley carburetor, including its little power valve and its jets, to try to emulate and get as close as possible with the air-fuel ratio to a fuel injected car. Let's go.
Okay guys, this is what you're going to need to know when you're looking at this screen. So we have our air fuel ratio line, our line graph, and this line graph is just a graphical representation of the air fuel ratio number, which is up in this area here. Then directly under the air fuel ratio we have the engine vacuum. It's measured in inches of mercury, which is the same vacuum as the power valves are measured in, inches of mercury. Then directly underneath that we have the car's RPM. And then over in this area here we've got the engine torque, or how much torque is being produced. And then to a lesser degree of importance over here is the horsepower that the car's making. And what you're going to notice is as the car is cruising along at very light throttle, we should be running somewhere near 14.7 to 1, and as the torque goes up, the vacuum will go down. So as I'm putting my accelerator foot down, the engine torque is going up, horsepower is going up, vacuum should be falling towards zero or close to zero. It won't get to zero, but it'll get close to zero, and the air fuel ratio should gradually richen up to somewhere around the high 12, so 12.7, you might see 12.5, somewhere around there. So those are the important bits of information that you have to know what you're looking at for these comparisons. Okay, so you've just seen the first load up there of our EFI car. We'll do another couple so that you can see what's going on. So you can see that as the torque's going up, the air fuel ratio is gradually richening up as we get very close to full throttle. And you can see the engine vacuum dropping and the RPM going up. And then as I back off there, you'll notice a big spike here, a big lean spike. That's because this is an EFI car and it has a deceleration fuel cut function, which means that when we back off, the injectors actually switch off to save fuel. So you can just see that there. That's what that lean spike is on the back off. But this is what it's supposed to look like. This is how perfect it should be with an EFI car, and we're going to try and replicate that with our carburetor.
Okay guys, so we've just seen what it's supposed to look like, what an EFI car looks like with all the computer control, with the perfect air fuel ratio on transition from light throttle to full throttle. That's what it's supposed to look like. Now we're going to put a carbureted car on the dyno and we're going to try and emulate the same thing with a carburetor. Okay, so we've got our test mule car on the dyno now, a 1968 or 69 Camaro with a 454 big block in it and a brand new 750 double pumper Holley. So we've already seen what an EFI car looks like in the terms of the transition from light throttle to heavy throttle. And I'm going to show you how we're going to try to replicate that with a carburetor. So we're going to try and do the same thing as the EFI car with the carburetor using the little Holley Power Valve. In fact, we won't be able to get a carburetor to replicate what an EFI car does without this little guy. Okay, so we've taken our carby straight off the car and I've just pulled the front of it down. That's why it's all dirty here. It's been on there and it's been misbehaving, and I'm tuning this vehicle as we're going. So I'm actually doing a dyno tune on this as it's a customer's car. So this is our little power valve here. Okay, now what this power valve, what it is, the name power valve is a bit misleading. It should be called a progression valve. It should be called a progression valve because what it does is it bridges a gap in the fueling between the primary main jets and when the secondary main jets open. Okay, now I'll explain that in a little while. Okay, now this one's straight out of the factory. This car hasn't been tuned before, and this one's a 4.5. So what this refers to is that this is how much manifold vacuum you need, or the threshold of manifold vacuum that you need to cross for this little valve to open. So it has a vacuum diaphragm in here. There's a little vacuum diaphragm which is exposed to manifold vacuum, and you can sort of see that moves like this. So if there's manifold vacuum on this side, it'll pull this closed. So this will be closed, and this little valve here remains shut, and it sits in our little metering block here like this. So it sits in there, and when the metering block is in the carburetor, that sits in there. So the little valve sits like this. Now in this little chamber here, it's exposed to manifold vacuum through a channel that goes down here, straight through the carburetor and into the plenum chamber of the manifold. So this area is exposed to manifold vacuum, and when it has a vacuum on it, it'll pull it closed like this. You can see it's closed there. And then when the manifold vacuum drops beyond 4.5 inches of vacuum, this valve will open. On this side of the valve, there's raw fuel. Raw fuel will pass through this passageway into this passageway here, and it'll go into these, what we call power valve channel restrictors, right, or PVCR. And these channel restrictors go straight into the main fuel well. Now here are your main jets are here. Now I've taken these out at the moment, so it's easy to see, but you're putting extra fuel from the raw fuel on this side. You're putting it straight through this valve, which will sit in here. You're going through this valve into this passageway, and you're putting extra fuel through these holes straight into the main fuel well, and that main fuel gets sucked up through this channel here, out of this channel here, and straight into the auxiliary venturi and straight into the engine. Okay, so what the valve does is it bridges a gap whereby the main jets can't keep up anymore. So the main jets can't keep up anymore, but the secondaries still haven't opened. The secondary valve here hasn't opened. So this little valve here bridges a fueling gap, bridges a gap in the fuel supply from the main jets to when the secondary jets open. Okay, now there's a bit of a long-standing myth that if you put in a power valve that's too low of a vacuum reading, that the power valve will be open at idle, right? And in a way this is true, but your car's not going to run rich because of it. Because if I've got a 4.5 power valve and my car idles at 2 inches of vacuum at idle, and I've got a 4.5 in there, you could argue that this valve's going to be open at idle, okay? But if the valve's open at idle, you're not going to run any richer, because the only way that the fueling from this power valve can get into the carburetor is through the main jets. So remember, the fuel goes through these channels, it goes into the main jet well in here, it gets drawn up this well, which is up here, out this hole, through this hole here where the auxiliary venturi is, right, and then straight through the auxiliary venturi into the engine. So you have to be on the main circuit for this little valve here to have any influence on the engine whatsoever. You need to have enough throttle opening for you to be pouring fuel out of the auxiliary venturi or the venturi booster, which is this here, and into the engine. So if you have a low idle vacuum of say 2 inches of vacuum and you've got any power valve that's above 2 inches of vacuum, yes, it will be open at idle, but the fuel will not be flowing out of the venturi booster into the engine. So it cannot have any influence on your engine at idle if it is open. Okay, so the strength of this spring here is what determines what vacuum reading we give to this valve. So if this spring here is a stronger spring, it's going to want to pull that valve open much earlier, and it's going to take much less manifold vacuum to hold this, it's going to take much more manifold vacuum to overcome the spring tension and hold this little valve closed, okay? So this vacuum reading here controls the when this valve is going to open. So this controls the when is this valve going to open, or how much load, how much accelerator pedal am I going to have for this valve to open. And the size of these power valve channel restrictors here controls how much fuel it's going to add. Now on some carburetors, these are adjustable. They have little screw-in jets, sort of like this one here. Well, this is a press-in, but they have sort of screw-in jets that you can unscrew and change, and you can make the hole here bigger or smaller. So this controls the how much. So the vacuum value of this valve controls when the valve is going to open, and then this here, the size of this passage, controls how much extra fuel is going to be added when the valve opens. All right, so sometimes it also helps to think of the power valve in terms of opening early or late. Sometimes that's easier for some people to think that, okay, is it going to open early or is it going to open late? So this one here, 4.5, this is quite a late opening power valve. So you're going to need a lot of throttle on this one for it to open, or it's going to open very late. If you had, say, a 10.5 power valve, it's going to open very early. You're not going to need a lot of throttle at all for it to open. So a little bit of throttle opening and it's going to open. All right. So a 10.5 would be an early opening power valve, and a 4.5 or a 3.5 and a 2 or a 2.5 would be a late opening power valve. So if you try to think of it in terms of early or late, that might help you understand what it's doing and how it's working. Okay, just to show you the difference here between the spring tension in a 4.5 versus a 10.5. So remember, this is 10.5 inches of vacuum or 4.5 inches of vacuum. So this 10.5 here has quite a strong spring, and the 4.5 here has a very weak spring. So this one here will open much earlier because the 10.5 you'll need a much stronger manifold vacuum to hold that closed. And as your manifold vacuum falls, as you're putting your foot down, this spring here is going to overcome the manifold vacuum much earlier, and this will open much earlier. Okay, now I don't know if you've seen one of these before, but this is a power valve block off. Okay, this is a blank valve, which is just going to, well, it's not a valve at all, it's just a block off, which is going to block this off. Now, one of the great things about carburetors is that if you want to see what area is affected, what area of the fuel curve is affected by what jet, just pull that jet out or block it off or block the jet off, and you'll see pretty quickly what area of the fuel curve that jet is going to be affected by. So if you want to see where your main jets have an effect, pull them out. So if you pull the main jets out, it's going to run really rich and it's not going to run any good, but you'll be able to see the point at where the main jets are coming in, because you'll have a massive rich spot in that area. Same with the power valve. I'm just going to take this power valve out and I'm going to block it off just to show you what area is affected by the power valve, what the power valve is going to do. So I'm going to show you what it's going to do without the power valve there, and then we'll put the power valve back in, and I will show you what area of the fuel curve the power valve is responsible for and what area the power valve is going to affect. So I'm not suggesting that you put a block off in there and block your power valve off because you really need your power valve, but I'm just going to show you the difference of with it blocked off completely and then with it there and functioning correctly, and you'll be able to see the difference in the fuel curve in real time on the dyno.
Okay, so we're about to see our carbureted car with the power valve blocked off. Now for these comparisons, please understand that they are two very, very different engines. The EFI car is an automatic transmission, so its RPM will be higher and its power output will be higher because it's more modified. With the 454 big block, it's a manual transmission, so the RPM will not go as high. But the Loadup is the same on the accelerator pedal, and it'll make less torque, but we're loading them up the same. Okay, so at this point the air fuel ratio is quite lean for the amount of torque that the car's making because we don't have a power valve in place, and just there you can see the secondaries crash in. Okay, so we'll have a look at that again in just a moment. So here we go, we're cruising along at very light throttle, low RPM, light load. And as the load goes up, there's a little bit of enrichment because we've got a little bit of accelerator pump there. But then as I continue to load up, the car should be richening at this point. It's staying in the 14s. It's quite lean now, staying in even the 15s. And then all of a sudden, the secondaries are going to open and they're going to crash in, which you'll see in a second. Just there, that's the secondaries crashing in, but there's no enrichment before the secondaries open. Okay, you're about to see our load up with the carbureted car with the correct power valve in place. We ended up with a 6.5 power valve. The car came in with a 4.5 power valve. So by this time, we've already trialled a few different power valves. We trialled an 8.5. We also trialled a 10.5. Now you'll notice that the car is cruising along at this point on the primary main jets. The primary main jets have already been decided, and that's where you see the car cruising nice and lean at 15 or so to 1. As I load it up, as we cross the 6.5 threshold, which we're just doing now, you can see the car, the air fuel ratio richen up, and it gets richer and richer as we load up, and by this point the secondaries are opened. Okay, now any modified car should be able to cruise somewhere in the 14s or even the low 15s like this one is doing right now. You might not be able to idle at the 14s because of the cam size, but you can certainly cruise at the 15s. As you can see, as we cross the 6.5 threshold of manifold vacuum, the car richens up.
Right, so there you have it. That's the power valve operation. You've seen it work on the dyno. You've seen what happens when we don't have the power valve. So the power valve bridges a gap in fueling between the primary main jets and when the secondary barrel opens, or when the secondary main jets come in. So this little guy operates before the secondary even opens. It does continue to operate once you're at wide open throttle and all the barrels are open at the same time. It continues to operate, but it starts its operation, or it's supposed to start its operation, before the secondary barrel opens. So it bridges that gap between where the primary main jets just can't flow enough fuel to support the needs of the engine, right at the end of the primary barrel, just before the secondary's open. This bridges that gap, and then the secondary's open and the secondaries crash in, and then the fueling is corrected, if you like, the fueling is corrected to meet engine demand by the secondaries opening. More air flows in, more fuel flows in, and you've got your wide open throttle air fuel ratio. So this guy bridges a gap between the primary main jets and the secondary main jets, and you've seen that operate. I hope it's been able to be clear enough for you to understand, and that's how a power valve works. And for any street car, you need the power valve. Yes, some people say that keep it blocked off on a race car, but a race car means race car. That means trailer it to the track, get it off the trailer, start the car, just before the start line, idle to the start line, and then gun it, okay? That's race car. If you've got any kind of car that you're driving to and from the track, you need to really tune it with a power valve, okay? If you have, the power valve removed and people say, just rich in the main jets to compensate, you will be running very, very, very rich indeed before the power valve opens. You'll be fouling plugs and all kinds of things, and that's never desirable.